Hello fantastic people, I hope you are doing great. Making the UI look good is a difficult task, but it gets even more difficult if we try to get it work on different screen sizes. By no means this video will try to be a complete guide into responsive UIs, simply because this subject is huge and I still have quite a lot to learn about it. That being said, I hope you will find some useful tips and tricks in this video. Let's get started. I start by creating new canvas. To make working with it slightly easier, I enable the 2D view. If I would have to choose one thing that will make your life easier when it comes to responsive design, it would be the UI scale mode setting on the canvas scaler. Let me show you how it works. First, I add new UI image. As its source image, I select this simple box. Then, without changing any other settings, I move the box a little bit to the right. Then I change to the game window and start resizing it to simulate different screen sizes. So let me quickly explain you what is happening. By default, the center of the block is attached to the center of the scene. Neither the distance nor the box itself are scaled. So the one thing I always start with is going to the canvas object, and then on its canvas scaler component I change the UI scale mode from the constant pixel size to scale with screen size. Now we have to set our reference resolution. In my case, I like to set it to high definition, which is 1280 by 720. We have to make sure that the screen match mode is set to match width or height. Notice that the slider at the bottom is set to width. That means that the width will influence 100% of the scaling. Changing height of the screen will have no effect whatsoever. When we change it to height, the situation will be completely reversed. The exact value will depend on the UI you are building, and of course on the rotation of the device you want to support. If your game will be played mainly using the landscape view, I would set the value to width. If your primary view will be the portrait mode, I would set it probably to height. Though once again, it really depends on the UI you are building. So unfortunately, you will have to experiment a little bit yourself. Let's change the subject for a second. If you look closely, you'll see my box is a little bit blurry. This is a pretty common issue. The easiest way to fix that is to change the filter mode of the sprite from bilinear to point no filter. We click apply and boom, magic. Let's for a second change the UI scale mode on the canvas back to constant pixel size. In order to build nice responsive UIs, you will have to understand fully the anchors and pivot of the UI elements. Let's make the box a little bit smaller. I'm going to make it 80 by 80. If we have a look at the selected anchor preset, we'll notice that the middle center option is selected. That means that the image's pivot point position is calculated in relation to this particular point on the canvas. If we start dragging the image around the canvas, we'll see the lines and the numbers representing the distance from the anchor. As we said before, the distance and the size of the objects are not scaled in this particular mode. To avoid the clipping, we can readjust the anchor of the image. If, for example, our UI element is supposed to be at the bottom right corner, we can attach it to that particular part of the canvas. And that will mean that regardless of the size of the screen, the element will stay at constant distance from this particular corner. To be exact, the element's pivot point. That means if we change the position of our image to 0, 0, the canvas corner will be exactly in its center. If we align it with the edges, we'll see that the position is -40 and 40. And this is as expected, because 40 is exactly half size of our box. There are many use cases where we would like our pivot point to be in a different position. Conveniently, we can adjust it while selecting the anchor preset. When we open the anchor presets pop-up and start holding shift, we'll notice that the blue dot appeared on each of the icons. Now selecting the preset will also adjust the pivot point. We can see it also in the scene. The blue dot from the middle of the box moved to its bottom right corner. If we start dragging the image now, we'll see that the lines representing distance from the anchor are now drawn from the corner of the box. Beautiful. Just remember, there's nothing wrong with setting the pivot manually by changing the values in the inspector. Let's for example move it to the top left corner. As said before, when we hold shift when selecting the anchor preset, we'll be also setting the object's pivot point. We can also hold the Alt key, which will move the object to the desired location. Now let's have a look once again at the anchors. If we look closely, the anchor is not defined simply by X and Y position, but rather by 2 points. That means our anchor is in fact a rectangle. Instead of defining simple point on the screen, we can define area to which our object should be anchored. Once we set the anchors, we can adjust the left, top, right and bottom margins, or simply move the object around, and then when we start changing the size of the screen, the canvas will try to keep the margins as we set them in relation to the bounding box of our anchor. This is one of the ways we could create responsive UI. If set correctly, the image will be scaling nicely. However, I still find it a little bit easier to work with the Scale with Screen Size UI scale mode. Let's now have a look at the sliced image type. I create a new UI image, and then as its source image I use this simple shape. When I try to change its width and height, it doesn't look too good. Let's see what we can do about it. First, I change its image type from simple to sliced. Nothing changed besides new warning saying that this image doesn't have any border. Let's fix that using the sprite editor. If we click on the image and look closely, we'll see that each of the sides of the border has a green square in the middle of it. By dragging those points around, we can select which areas of the image are its sides, corners and the central piece. Then this information can be used to scale nicely the image. The corners will stay unscaled. The vertical sides will be scaled only vertically and the horizontal ones horizontally. And then of course the central piece will be scaled as needed. Now we click Apply button and close the window. And boom, our image looks much better. Let's just have a look how it looked before. Huge difference, isn't it? Now we can freely change the size of the image. If you think that the borders are too small or too big, you can simply adjust the pixels per unit multiplier in the image type settings. Smaller value will make the borders bigger, and of course the other way around. When we'll have a look at the anchor presets, we'll see also stretch options. They do nothing special besides setting the min and max anchors to be positioned at the edges of the canvas. We can use the margin of the object to give it a little bit of spacing around. Let's now have a look in the game mode how it behaves. Fantastic! Now as the image's child object I'm going to add Text Mesh Pro. I change its font asset and then set its text to some random text. Then using the anchor preset I stretch it in both directions. Notice interesting thing. The object has been stretched in regards to its parent, not to the canvas. This is very useful, but also very important thing to remember. The anchors are set in relation to the parent object. Now let's have a look at the most useful checkbox when it comes to responsiveness of the Text Mesh Pro. The auto size. Once you check this magical checkbox, the size of the font will be adjusted to make sure that the whole content fits inside the boundaries of the object. Now let's set the alignment and the margins. And of course let's have a look how it looks like in the game mode. Fantastic! Let's now try to add a button under the text. First, let's change the text's bottom margin to have a little bit of extra space. I don't have any button sprite prepared, but let's try to do a little bit of magic. I'm going to open my UI image using the sprite editor. I think we can try to slice the square. That will be okay. Let's apply the changes and close the window. Now under my image I create another child object, button Text Mesh Pro. I change its anchor, pivot and position to the bottom center. Notice that because both my anchors are at the same position, I don't have margin fields. Instead of them, I have the X and Y and Z position, width and height. Let's change the Y position to move the object a little bit higher. Then let's change its source image and adjust its size. Now let's change the text and the font. Then once again I'm going to check the auto size checkbox and add a little bit of margin around the text. And here we have nice responsive pop-up. To make it look a little bit nicer, we can try to adjust the pixels per unit setting, and then use the shadow component to add a little bit of shadow. Fantastic! Let's now move to the second example. This time we'll create something like party members overlay. I start by creating an empty game object under our canvas. I use the anchor to stretch it on the right side of the screen. Then I manually adjust its width. I rename the object to online bar. I add to it vertical layout group component. This component will make rearranging things into vertical list very easy. Inside the online bar I add simple image, and then I duplicate it few times. As you see, they are automatically arranged for me. If I would prefer their position to be different, I can control it using the child alignment setting. When the control child size checkboxes are unchecked, and at the same time the child force expand are checked, the component is adding extra margins to the children in order to make them occupy the whole space. Now let's have a look at the control child size. Those checkboxes allow the layout group to change the object size. As far as I know, there are two situations in which that will happen. First, if we also check the child force expand, instead of empty space added from the sides, the image will be scaled to occupy as much space as possible. And then, in case there is not enough space to host the children components, they will be scaled down as needed. As you see, the image's aspect ratio is not considered when scaling down or up. We can change it by checking the Preserve Aspect checkbox on the images themselves. Now let's change the scale of one of the images. Interestingly, it occupies exactly the same space as before. If we would like the layout group to consider the child scale, we can check the Use Child Scale checkboxes. Okay, let's now get to work. Inside of our online bar, I create another empty object and call it Person. I add to it Vertical Layout Group. There is nothing wrong with having nested layouts. Inside of it I add TextMesh Pro component and call it Name. I change its value and adjust the font asset. Just remember that now the anchor is controlled by the layout group. If you try to change it, it will either behave weirdly or have no effect whatsoever. So now if you would like to adjust the position of the objects, you should be using the layout group instead. Now I'm adding another text to indicate the character level. I think they will look better aligned to the right side. So I change the child alignment. I give it a little bit of breathing space by adding the right padding. As part of my person object, I add a simple image. As its source image, I add simple white square. I adjust its height, and then in order to make it occupy the whole width of the parent, I use the checkbox Child Force Expand Width. Now as its child object, I add another image. I select the border sprite, I make it stretch vertically and horizontally, and then adjust its margins. Notice that there is nothing wrong with them having negative values. That basically means the object will be stretching outside of the parent object. Once again, to make sure everything looks correctly, I do a little bit of extra slicing inside the sprite editor. And then, of course, I change the image type from simple to sliced. A little bit of extra size adjustments, and then small change to the health bar background color. Now I'm ready to add another child image. I call it bar and give it nice red color. Now I stretch it in all 4 directions. Notice that the UI images do not have the sorting layer and order in layer settings. To control the order in which they are drawn, we simply reorder them in hierarchy window. And now I move a little bit the right edge of the bar, just to indicate the health is not full. If you would like to learn how to make working health bars, you can check those tutorials. Now I'm making some last colors and size adjustments. Notice that on the TextMesh Pro there's this magical option, which will make sure that the text is nicely centered vertically. Now using the setting on the vertical layout group, I add a little bit of spacing between the objects. Now I'm going to make a T because Unity crashed. And just after I'm back, On our online bar object, I'm going to uncheck the child force expand height. I'm adding a little bit of spacing and then duplicating several times the person object. Now I just have fun and add a little bit of variety. Now let's have a look how it behaves in the game window. As we see, once again the UI scale mode makes it scale nicely. I experiment here with very weird screen sizes, but generally the ratio between width and height of the screen won't change that drastically. The resolution may, but the differences in ratio will stay pretty reasonable. In order to make the text a little bit more visible, I'm going to add a nice outline to it. We'll be doing that on the font settings. We can click on any Text Mesh Pro assets, scroll down to the font settings, and then in the face section, we increase the dilate value. And just after that, we increase also the thickness of the outline. Because I use different fonts for the name and the level, I need to repeat the steps for the second font. It looks much better. And now it's time to create another part of our UI. Under the canvas object, I create new empty object and call it bottom bar. Using the anchor preset, I stretch it at the bottom of the screen. Then I adjust its height a little bit. Inside of it, I create new image and call it quick slot. I change its source image to the sprite we've seen already before. Because we sliced it, the image type by default is set to sliced. Let's change it to simple. Inside of the quick slot, I create Text Mesh Pro. I call it key. Using the anchor preset, I stretch it in all directions. I change the value to 1 and then adjust its alignment. I would like the number to be a little bit outside the box, so I'm going to change a little bit its right and bottom margins. This time, on the bottom bar object, I'm going to add the horizontal layout group. Nothing surprising there. It has exactly the same settings as the vertical group, just helps you arrange things in the horizontal order. I uncheck the force expand checkboxes and change the child alignment to middle center. I add a little bit of spacing and then duplicate the quick slots several times. I change the values of the keys under the quick slots. Now I select all of the keys and adjust their margins. Let's have a look how it behaves in the game window. Great. Now inside of my bottom bar I add another UI image. I call it HP ball. As its image I select this simple ball. I adjust its color and then change its position on the bar. I want the ball to be a little bit bigger, so I increase its width and height. I'm copy-pasting the ball and changing the name of the new one to Mana Ball. And of course I readjust its color. Because my match slider on the canvas scaler is set to height, the change of the width doesn't scale UI at all. Remember to experiment with the value pretty often when you are building your UI. Remember, you can utilize the child alignment to, for example, hide certain elements outside of the screen. Maybe you want the balls to be visible only partially. Of course, we can also use the alignment to make them fully visible. Let's have a look at yet another example of UI element. I start by creating UI image. As its source image, I select the pop-up sprite we've seen at the very beginning of the video. I make it a little bit bigger. I hope that at this moment of the video you will feel comfortable to attach the object to any part of the canvas you want. In my case, I'm going to simply attach it to the left top corner. And I rename it to inventory. This time I'm not going to add any layout group. I simply add new Text Mesh Pro object, change its font and its value to inventory. Then I anchor it to the top of the parent object. Now I add another Text Mesh Pro. I change its value to X. I make it bold and adjust its size. I make it vertically and horizontally centered using the alignment settings. Then I'm disabling the wrapping and making sure that the overflow is set to overflow. Then I set the size of the object to 0, 0. Then I change its anchor preset to top right corner and readjust the position manually. Woohoo! We have nice close button. Now as the inventory's third child, I create simple empty object. I call it grid. I stretch it to occupy the whole parent space. And just after that, I adjust its top margin to do not be over the inventory title. Now it's time for the rest of the margins. We use the vertical and horizontal layout group, but it turns out there's also grid layout group. Let's add it to our object. Now the settings here are slightly different. Let's first add simple image and then change its source to our favorite slot box. Now let's duplicate it several times. We see that the grid layout works straight away. Let's first have a look at the start corner setting. It dictates where the first box will be placed. For the start axis, let's decrease the number of children a little bit. This setting allows us to select the primary axis. That means in which direction we'll be adding the boxes until we run out of space. Vertical means that we'll start creating second column after the first one is completed. The horizontal means that first we'll create first row, then second, and so on, so on. The child element is pretty self-explanatory. Once we draw all the cells and we know the final size of the grid, how it should be aligned. The most interesting setting, however, is the constraint. Flexible means that we start adding boxes in the direction specified as the start axis. And as soon as we run out of space, we either go to the next column or next row. And of course we repeat the process as many times as we need. The fixed row count or fixed column count will force the grid to keep the certain number of columns or rows if that's possible. The interesting thing is the cell size setting. As you see, it expects you to provide exact values. Because of that, it is not as responsive as the vertical and horizontal layouts. With a little bit of scripting, you could definitely make a grid using the horizontal and vertical layouts. If you know what is the intended way of making this component responsive, please let me know in the comment. The last setting, which has been explored already before, is the spacing, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And here we are. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I hope you learned something useful. If so, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a like under this video. And most importantly, have a fantastic day, love you and bye bye.